My husband suddenly told me.
I have to go to work now. You'll have to walk to the hospital yourself.
What? I asked my husband, who was driving next to me, even though I was drowsy from a fever over 104 degrees Fahrenheit. We were on a nearly deserted and dimly lit street. My husband was in the middle of taking me to the hospital because I had developed a fever. Indeed, when I had asked him to take me, he looked displeased. But when I called the ambulance, he canceled it without asking, saying it was a bother over just a fever. As I was thinking about this, I realized that my husband had already stopped the car and came around to open the passenger door. Is he intending to drag me out? With my weak hands, I desperately clung to the passenger seat. But my resistance was futile. He dragged me out of the car and threw me outside. He snorted, returned to the driver's seat, and said, "Figure it out yourself. You can make it to the hospital if you walk for an hour, right? And don't bother strangers for help, got it?" Then he drove off immediately. "Please, stop, come back." I knew my cries wouldn't reach the car growing distant, and I didn't even have the strength to stand anymore, so I could only sob and weakly call for help. "Someone, please help me. My name is Naomi. I'm a 40-year-old housewife. I live in a small town in the Midwest with my husband, Daniel, and our 16-year-old son, Ethan. Daniel and I met through a friend's introduction. At the beginning of our relationship, Daniel always said, "I'll climb the ladder, just stick with me." Seeing his ambition, I thought marrying him would make me happy. I was happy at the beginning of our marriage. He worked for a well-known corporation and earned a good salary. We spent enjoyable days together, watching movies or going shopping on days off. However, as our son Ethan was born and grew, those days started to change. Firstly, Daniel never got involved in parenting. He never changed a diaper, nor did he ever bathe Ethan. He never participated in an open class at his son's school, even when he had time off. We've never even been on a family vacation together. In short, Daniel never did anything that could be considered fatherly. As a result, Ethan and Daniel hardly talk anymore. Of course, knowing that this wasn't right for a family, I had tried to mend our relationship. However, Daniel dismissed the attempts, claiming I was too tired from work to have a proper conversation, letting the matter slide without resolution. We lived together, and it gradually became clear that Daniel was a coward. Daniel's big talk wasn't driven by ambition, but was merely bluster. The words he said before we got married, "I'll climb the ladder, just stick with me," were just to ensure I wouldn't leave him for someone else. Indeed, Daniel earns more than the average man, but compared to his peers at the same company, he hasn't climbed very high in the hierarchy. It's not that I wanted him to succeed at all costs, but I couldn't help thinking that, if he was going to immerse himself in work to the detriment of his family, he should at least achieve more. One day, after sending Ethan off to his soccer club's morning practice, I was preparing Daniel's breakfast. Daniel came from the bedroom to the living room and stared intently at the breakfast laid out on the table. The menu was the usual: bacon and bread, along with hash browns and an omelet. Daniel sat down on the chair and started with the omelet. Then, frowning and knitting his brows, "What's this?" he muttered. What? Was something off? It's the same omelet as always. However, Daniel roughly set down the plate with the omelet and declared, "It's inedible," before getting up and leaving the table. Since then, he has been complaining about every meal I make. The lunches I packed for him were returned almost untouched, with the excuse they were too awful to eat. He said, "Don't feed me this stuff even though I'm tired from work," and he started to leave dinner untouched. And Daniel's complaints extended beyond cooking to laundry and cleaning as well. He told me to straighten the clothes more when hanging them on the balcony. He once touched the window frame with his finger and said, "There is so much dust." Despite doing the housework as usual, he suddenly started complaining like this. Moreover, when he complained about my housework, he'd say things like, "Other women would do a better job," as if he was comparing me to someone. It was clearly suspicious, and almost as if his comments came from closely observing another woman doing housework recently. Since then, his actions became suspicious, like taking his smartphone with him to the bathroom or shower, or whispering on the phone in his study. I wondered if he might be cheating. I tried to find proof by checking his bag or sneaking a peek at his phone after he went to sleep, but I found nothing. I considered hiring a private investigator, but since Daniel managed our finances, I didn't have the freedom to use money and had to give up on that idea. Weeks passed with these uneasy feelings. Conversations with Daniel dwindled even more, and living with constant complaints from him, I felt a great deal of stress. Could that be the reason? Maybe because of that, one night, I woke up feeling extremely hot and realized I had a high fever. Recently, Daniel and I had been sleeping in separate rooms, so I couldn't ask for help. I managed to crawl to the living room because I had left my phone in the living room. Feeling like my vision was fading, I might have been exaggerating, but I felt like my life was in danger. I should call an ambulance. Just as I thought that and reached for my phone on the living room table, Daniel happened to come into the living room.
What are you doing up in the middle of the night?
I mustered all my strength to explain, and Daniel silently took the phone from my hand. Might he call an ambulance for me? Feeling relieved with that thought, Daniel then uttered something unbelievable to me.
Calling an ambulance for just a fever? How embarrassing would that be if the neighbors found out? You can't even do housework properly, but bothering me is something you're good at. Go back to sleep. A fever will go away if you sleep.
Far from being concerned, Daniel snapped at me, and I protested through tears. Please, let me go to the hospital. If an ambulance is out of the question, then please take me in our car. I begged Daniel, clinging to him. I kept pleading, almost babbling, "Please, please." Despite his reluctance, Daniel seemed to give in to my persistence and agreed to drive me. Daniel was very reluctant at first, but it seemed he finally gave in to my persistence and agreed to drive me.
Oh, no, I have work tomorrow. What are you going to do about my lost sleep?
From the driver's seat, Daniel continued to grumble and complain the entire time. I rested my head against the rain-pelted passenger window, listening to him. 5 minutes after leaving home, Daniel's phone suddenly rang. He pulled over to the side of the road to answer it. After a brief exchange, he quickly ended the call. Then he said the following:
"Now I have to go to work. You'll have to walk to the hospital from here."
"What? Work? In the middle of the night?"
Are you doubting me?
Daniel raised his voice, looking annoyed. "Then go to work, but at least drop me off at the hospital first. It's not far by car." It was impossible to walk to the hospital in the heavy rain in my condition. I desperately clung to the passenger seat. But Daniel got out of the driver's seat, opened the passenger door with force, unbuckled my seat belt, and grabbed my shoulder.
"Get out quickly."
With those words, Daniel dragged me out of the car as if he was throwing my body outside. I scraped my knees and palms with such force. It was dark, and I couldn't see well, but it felt like I was bleeding. "It hurts, you know," I said to Daniel, but he just snorted, returned to the driver's seat, and drove off immediately. I could only watch helplessly as the car got smaller and smaller in the distance. The rain kept getting stronger, and it felt like my fever was rising. There was no one around on the night streets, and Daniel had taken my smartphone with him. My only option was to walk to the hospital. In a desperate state, I headed for the hospital. Since Daniel had contacted the hospital in advance, I was sure the staff would be waiting for me. Thinking that I shouldn't waste any more of their time or that of other patients, I walked to the hospital despite feeling dizzy and disoriented. I got lost and had to rest along the way, but by the time I finally made it to the hospital, 2 hours had passed since I left home. A trip that should have taken only 15 minutes by car. I made my way towards the entrance, aiming for the door. Then, through the glass doors, I locked eyes with a nurse. The moment we made eye contact, I felt a wave of relief and lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed. It seemed like the medication and the intravenous drip had worked because my fever had gone down. As I stared blankly at the ceiling, I heard a familiar voice. It was my son's voice.
"Mom, are you okay?"
Ethan asked with a worried look on his face. "Yes, I'm fine. Sorry for worrying you." "Wait, why is Ethan here?" As I pondered this question, Ethan smiled slightly and helped me sit up. To my surprise, Daniel was there too. He was sitting on a low chair, looking exhausted. His clothes were soaking wet, and his usually neat hair was a mess, as if he had been caught in a storm. For some reason, his legs were shaking uncontrollably. I wondered what had happened while I was unconscious.
"Hey, you have something to say to Mom, don't you?"
Ethan said to Daniel in a dismissive tone. Then Daniel jerked and shivered, lifting his face up. He looked gaunt, and the dark circles under his eyes were severe.
I'm sorry."
Daniel said in a small voice. Ethan looked a bit dissatisfied, but turned back to me and explained what had happened. After Daniel dragged me out of the car, he apparently went back home. Ethan, sensing something was wrong, had woken up and found it strange that I wasn't at home. When Daniel returned, Ethan asked him where I was, but Daniel tried to dodge the question. However, Ethan pressed him further until Daniel confessed to leaving me out in the rain. Ethan, being physically larger than Daniel, must have intimidated him. After a bit of arguing, the hospital called to inform Ethan that I had arrived safely. Ethan suggested to Daniel, "Let's go to the hospital to check on Mom now." But Daniel refused, saying, "I have work tomorrow." Ethan, furious, grabbed Daniel and insisted, "You walk to the hospital too." Faced with Ethan's threatening demeanor, Daniel, being watched by Ethan on his mountain bike, jogged through the rain to the hospital. Daniel, who usually commutes by car and dislikes exercise, must have found this extremely difficult. It's no wonder he was so worn out and exhausted. After finishing his explanation, Ethan looked at me seriously and said,
Mom, you should divorce this guy right away.
I was shocked by his words. Not because I didn't want to divorce. I was shocked that I had driven my son to say such a thing. I took Ethan's hand and apologized, saying, "I'm sorry." For a while after that, Daniel and I were in a Cold War state. I wanted to divorce, but there were financial concerns. As a housewife, I wasn't confident I could adequately support Ethan if we were to divorce. I wondered what Daniel thought about all this. A few weeks after I had a high fever. One day, the landline at home rang.
Hello? Are you Daniel's wife? My name is Amy, one of his employees.
Well, yes, that's me. Is there something you need? The woman who introduced herself as Amy said to me, who was bewildered.
Daniel and I are in love. So could you please divorce him quickly?
Amy was having an affair with Daniel. My previous suspicions of infidelity weren't misplaced. I would divorce him if I could. I found myself shouting that in response, almost instinctively. That was my true feeling. Take that lousy man if you want him. Will I be insulted? With that thought, I steeled myself and gripped the receiver tightly. But Amy exclaimed, "Really?" with a happy voice.
Then it's settled. I work for a major corporation, so I can pay any amount in compensation. If you give me your email address, I'll send you plenty of evidence of my affair with Daniel. You can use that to demand a divorce from him.
Caught off guard by the unexpected proposal, I was momentarily stunned, but I quickly regained my composure. There's no way I could pass up such an opportunity. I gave her my email address. And soon after, she sent me ample evidence of the affair. There were la vie de vie photos and screenshots of their rendezvous messages, more than enough to serve as proof. That evening, after making sure Ethan had fallen asleep, I approached Daniel, who was having a drink. "Hey, we need to talk." Daniel just said, "What?" without taking his eyes off the TV. I was irritated, turned off the TV, and slammed my hand on the table. Daniel turned to face me, angry. I presented something right in front of Daniel. A divorce form. Daniel's eyes widened in shock. Let's get a divorce. It seems you have someone else who works for a major corporation and is good at housework.
What? Are you saying I'm cheating? If so, show me the proof.
Daniel said confidently, thinking he had covered his tracks. I met his challenge and presented all evidences Amy had sent me. His confident expression quickly fell, and he began to look like he was about to cry.
What? How do you have these? I deleted everything. A divorce would be embarrassing, right? And doesn't Ethan need a father? And money?
Daniel apparently doesn't want other people to think he got divorced because he cheated on his wife. How selfish of him. I'm not embarrassed at all. Besides, Ethan doesn't need a father like you. You've never done anything fatherly before. Don't start saying such things now. As for money, if you truly care about Ethan, you'll provide ample child support, won't you? Finally, Daniel seemed to realize I was serious about our divorce, holding his head and starting to sob. This isn't how it was supposed to go. Half a year later, Daniel and I were officially divorced. In the divorce, I demanded a fair division of assets, compensation for his infidelity, and ample child support for Ethan. Additionally, I demanded compensation for infidelity from Amy, the woman involved in the affair. Since the payments were made in lump sums from both parties, I had no immediate financial worries. I didn't want Ethan to go through the trauma of changing schools, so we moved to a nearby apartment, and now we are working together to make our lives work. It seems that Daniel and Amy started living together. However, both being busy with their jobs, they frequently argued over household chores, each trying to push responsibilities onto the other. Amy's efforts in housework were probably to show her best side to Daniel in an attempt to take him away from me. Once she had Daniel to herself, she likely felt comfortable revealing her true nature. Moreover, somehow, it became public knowledge that Daniel and Amy had an affair, tarnishing the reputation of the major corporation they worked for, and resulting in both of them being fired. They struggled to make ends meet after paying me the compensation in full, but that's none of my concern. Since divorcing Daniel, Ethan has become much brighter and more dedicated to his club activities.
I'll be a player for the first time in the upcoming match.
Watching him talk happily, I felt deep down that my decision was the right one.